Are we good? Are we on? We're live. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome. Hello. Thank you. Thank you. Great to have all of you here. If you don't know me, my name is Pastor Chris. I am the pastor of the church here, and this is going to be, we had talked some time ago, several of the church members here had been asking me about the issue of apologetics, which, if you're not familiar with that, it is not apologizing for your faith, but it is being able to give an answer when people ask tough questions about the Christian faith. And we had several people asking us about, we should do something. You should do some training in apologetics, or maybe we could do some kind of event. And I ended up talking with a friend of mine, Nick Shelna, who's here. There he is in the back. And he actually works with Apologetics, Inc., and they have their annual banquet, which is this weekend, and they send all of their speakers in to town here from across the country. And they said, we would love to send one of our speakers there to speak at your church. And I said that would be really, really great. So the stars kind of aligned, and here we are. And this is going to be the first of what we hope is an annual event. And that it just continues to grow as time goes by. But I'm very excited for tonight. We're going to have a guest speaker, Alicia Wood. She's here from Atlanta. Any Atlanta fans? No? Yeah, well, it's okay. I mean, I don't hate it. Go Braves. The only thing I know I know several things about Atlanta, but one of the things is don't try to travel through it at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. At 3 it starts? Okay. Good to know. Don't try around 3 o'clock to get through Atlanta. It's ridiculous. It's like worse than LA over there. Anyway, she's down here from Atlanta, and she works with Apologetics, Inc., and I asked her, I was like, what is your official title? And she said, I'm an apologist. So she is professionally, goes around and speaks to groups, talks to students. She goes to a lot of universities, secular universities, and addresses whatever students want to show up and try to grill her with questions. And she gives a defense for the faith, and she'll be doing so tonight. So she's going to give a talk, and then we're going to have some time after that for question and answer. So very excited about it. I feel like there was something else I was going to say, but I'll say it later when we close maybe. So without further ado, Alicia Wood.
Well, good evening. I'm like, what time is it? When you fly and you change places, you're not sure what's up or down. I'm totally okay if you are not an Atlanta fan. I hail from Rochester, New York. I'm an Atlanta transplant, which is actually true of a lot of people in Atlanta, actually. Most people from Atlanta, actually, I said most, but a good chunk are not from there, which is why you see all of a sudden politically, the state of Georgia starting to switch politically. You got so many transplants. So I come from the great state of New York, specifically Rochester. That might give you an indication as to which NFL team I support, which is also a headache. I grew up a Buffalo Bills fan. We've seen a lot of wide rights over our life, and it just kind of continues. And I don't know what's going on with that team, but I did move from Boston, so I sent you Tom Brady, so you're welcome. As you know, that worked out well for you all. Yeah, that was it answered the big final debate. Is it Brady or is it Belichick? Like, which one makes that team good? And then you send Brady and you do amazing, and so we now know. But all that to say, yes, as Chris said, I get to answer people's hard questions that they have about the faith. A lot of times non-Christians are like, look, I'm interested in this, but I don't really know who I can talk to that won't yell at me. Or I talk to a Christian, I'm trying to ask them a question, and they just kind of clam up and say, well, I just believe by faith, and they don't have any answers. And so they kind of feel like, where do I go? Like, who do I talk to when I have answers about this thing, this whole Christian thing? So I get to talk with non-Christians, but I also get to talk with Christians who are like, the world seems to be spinning out of control. I don't even know as a Christian, how does the Bible, is it relevant? I just spoke on that last week at Bay Hope. I was actually here last week, too, at Bay Hope on, is the Bible relevant in 2024? And people are wondering, is there really a reason to still believe in it or to still trust in it? Can it still speak to my issues today? And so as a result of that, that means that I stay quite busy. And so as Chris said, we are here, several of us are here, Nick included, of course, lives here, but are here this week because we are doing a series of events called Illuminate the Bay. If you want to find out about them, you can actually go to our website, apologetics.org. It's super easy. Apologetics.org. We have more events tomorrow. I think I'm at the University of Tampa tomorrow night. Christian school during the day, but there's other events. There's another event here tomorrow night. And then we have some stuff, I'm trying to think, Friday might be a private event because it's at a school. So you can't show up to the elementary school, guys, okay? You can't do that. But I think that might be a private. But either way, check it out. There might be some other things happening around the area that you might be interested in, so go to our website. And also, just so you know, in the back, we have a couple things. First of all, here is kind of just a card that kind of, if you're interested in joining our email list, ask that you just fill it out. And you can just bring it up here and put it up here and give it to me, and that's fine. But it's a bookmark that you can tear away right here. And on this bookmark, you're going to see all 4 different things. You're going to see our website, QR code. You're going to see our Universe Next Door, which is the fantastic podcast that Nick runs. You're going to see, which Chris was also on, talking about Psalm 22 and the crucifixion. I listened to that one before I even knew Chris. Matthew's YouTube channel, Matthew Middleberg, is another apologist that is with us. And then Mike Machard, who is our president, who's also an apologist, to his podcast. So you got different things happening here. So feel free. You want to join our email list and kind of keep up to date as to what's going on, or know when a new podcast comes out or a new article. We have articles on our website. I speak a lot on the transgender topic, and I just dropped one on intersex that's there. There's also another article that just dropped on Hebrew Israelitism. Many of you may not know what Hebrew Israelites are, but if you've passed them on the street corner, you will know who they are. And so we have an article on that, article on resurrection. There's all kind of things that could be helpful to you. So feel free to check that stuff out. Additionally, in the back, we have programs for our 7x7, which is our youth discipleship curriculum. It's one thing for me to come here and speak. Another thing then I just leave, right? It's another thing for you to be like, now what? But what we do, and I speak with a lot of young people because it's a lot of the older people, and I guess you would say maybe myself included in that, although I'm a little different boat because I engage with these issues. But a lot of older people are kind of like, we don't know what to say to this younger crowd. It's so different. You know, when I was a kid, I wasn't that long ago. I mean, I'm in my 40s now. But when I was a kid, nobody was wondering if they were male or female. It wasn't a question. Now, it was happening, right? Transgenderism is not a new thing. Yeah, it was happening, but it wasn't happening in your school. And so now parents are like, what in the world? And pastors and youth pastors and just aunts and uncles and grandmas and neighbors are like, what in the, it's stuff like that. We're like, what do we do? So we have a home discipleship curriculum that helps walk through some of the fundamentals of the Christian faith, as well as dealing with some of the harder questions as well. And we'll just really encourage you, if you want to do something like this, it's called 7x7. It's 7 weeks of last. We have the curriculum for you. Then the 8th week you have off. But we just ask that you create a meal. Do a meal and invite young people, middle school, high school, even college age to your house, and just go through the curriculum with them and just walk it through. And so if you're interested in anything like that, this is back there as well. We've got contact information as well. So just want to let you know that there's more resources than just me coming before you is the bottom line. So with that said, let me go ahead and jump right on in here. This is an interesting topic for me because I've been doing this topic now for, I've been an apologist for over 10 years. So probably for 9 of those 10 years, I've been kind of engaging with this 8 years. But if you were to ask me this question 8 years ago, I would give you a different answer than I'd give you today. It's like, it's the same topic, but my reasons keep changing. So what I'm going to give for you today are the reasons why in 2024, I would say why I'm a Christian or why I find Christianity compelling. What about it versus all these other religions that might be out there? What is it that stands out for me? I will be doing Q&A afterwards, and Nick is going to come up and join me during Q&A. And I don't limit my Q&As. I let my Q&As be open to any topic, something I didn't even talk on. And so feel free to ask when that time comes on any question you may have. If I don't know it, I'll make Nick answer it, and then it'll be fine, right? So we'll just throw all the hard ones to him, right? No, really, if I don't know the answer, it won't be my first time. I'll say I don't know. That's it. There's questions I get all the time. I'm like, man, I've never thought about that, especially if you're under 10. They ask some questions that you're like, man, I have just never even thought about that. But the point is, how can I help you as you're processing through the Christian faith yourself? So we will be doing that as well. So with that said, let me talk to you about why I'm a Christian in 2024. Like I said, this answer would change. And my short answer, just to lead you off and give you the spoiler already, is that Christianity works. Like, It just works. And I'm going to explain that as I go throughout. But it works. And I see it work in the world around me. It's got evidence for it, which is extremely important to me. I was a criminal justice major. Evidence is important, right? I was all about the investigation, Encyclopedia Brown books as a kid, all that kind of stuff. And so it works. It answers the big questions of life that we are also asking, whether it's 2024 or the year 4. So all that to say, I find it compelling for a list of reasons, which I'll go through with you today. But I want to tell you a little bit about my story. I grew up in a Christian home, which is probably the story of a lot of people in here. And, went to church on Sundays, mornings, church on Sunday nights. I grew up in a Pentecostal church. It was great. We danced our way through worship. It was wonderful. And then Wednesday night service. And then, of course, there was Sunday school. And then there was like youth thing. So I did it all, right? I was in church. Then I go to college. Right. Okay. Then I go to college. Right? And when I go to college, things get a little interesting. Now, I need to tell you that college was a Christian college. Okay? And it was not anything against this college, but it was in college when I first began to doubt. See, when I was a kid, it was like, okay, it was simple, right? God made us. That's how we got here. You went to church. I always was inquisitive and asked more questions to go deeper, but my reasons were simpler when I was a kid. So, you know how it is when you're a kid. It's easy. You look at the sky and you think, hey, this is cool. God made it. Look at that clouds, right? That worked. But when I went to college, things got a little bit trickier. And the reason why is because I was in a Bible class, because it was Bible college. We had to take a New Testament and Old Testament class. It wasn't a Bible college. It was a Christian college, excuse me. New Testament class and class and Old Testament class. And during one of those, I can't remember, I think it was the Old Testament one, this man was my teacher. He was a great godly man, ended up becoming one of the most influential people in my spiritual walk. And he was just talking about how the Bible was formed. Now, I'm like 18, 19, 20 years old, and I had just never thought about it. I didn't think it just fell from the sky, but I guess I just hadn't given it thought at that age yet. And so he's explaining, now this is how I heard it. This is not how it happened, okay? This is how I heard it at 19 years old. I heard that there was a bunch of letters and people kind of spread them on the table and say, okay, we're going to put this one in and this one. And this is talking about the New Testament here, just the New Testament. We're going to put this one in, this one, no, we'll keep that out. Well, we'll put this one in. No, not that one. No, not that one. Put this one in. That's how I heard it. That's not what happened. But that was when he was first talking, I was like, So here I was, 19, 20, whatever I was years old. And I remember sitting there in that class thinking, that's how this thing came together. And this is what the foundation of what I believe is grounded in. It's so arbitrary. And that one class, I don't know if it was an hour and 20 minutes long or a 50-minute long class, but that one class erased 18, 19 years of Christianity for me. And I walked out that class period that day saying that there is no God. There's no way in the world I could ever believe this stuff. And I remember walking back to my dorm that day, and it was just really interesting because I'm walking and I'm looking at the grass and I'm looking at the trees and I'm kind of like, this is it. And you look at the sky and you're like, this is it. Like, it was like my whole world shrunk, right? Because as Christians, you don't realize how much, you have a very large eternal perspective on stuff. You know that there's something even greater after death. Once I got rid of that, it was like my whole world shrunk. And I was like, this is it. It was just got smaller. But I'm at a Christian college. I'm in the gospel choir. People come to me for prayer. So who was I going to tell? So I didn't tell a soul. Because when I was growing up, nobody taught you could doubt. Nobody taught you could question. Nobody told you that people wondered whether or not this was true. So I, of course, thought, well, I can't tell anybody. God must be mad at me. People are going to be ashamed of me. People are going to reprimand me. How could you question? You know this is true. What are you thinking? So I kept my mouth shut. In fact, you now know more of my story than maybe my friends do. That were my friends then. They don't even know this story. All that to say, I didn't know what to do. Very short amount of time. I don't even know how long. month and a half, 2 months, 6 weeks, I don't even remember, short amount of time. I remember kind of thinking to myself, all right, Alicia, you can say there's no God, fine. But that doesn't mean that, like, I knew that there was prayers that I had offered that nobody else knew I was offering that prayer and it had been answered. So I want to say, you want to say there's no God, okay, but something heard you. So it was one of those situations where I was like, I wanted to throw it all away, but there was this thing that was telling me some kind of experience I had that was enough to make me say, before you throw it away, you can throw it away, but you've got to come up with a new answer for what heard you, what answered that prayer. Because here's the thing people don't realize. Atheism is not a default position. And that's what people do. They say, I don't believe in Christianity, I'm a default to atheism. Wrong. Atheism needs to stand on its own 2 feet. So I can say, hey, I don't believe in the Christian God anymore, but that just means the Christian God. Islam could be true. Hinduism could be true. Buddhism could be true. Jehovah's Witnesses, it all goes down the line there. And all of these questions that I'd answered, the meaning of life, morality, how do we live, how do we get here, all of those questions that I was answered by Christianity, okay, I say there's no Christianity, but those questions are still there. And now I need to come up with new answers for these questions. Just because I say I don't believe in God doesn't mean those questions go away. It just means those answers change. And so you're left in this situation of like, well, what do I do? Where do I land? Where do I go? What do I believe? So spoiler alert, I became Christian. No, I went back, right? I was able to say, you know what? Okay, Alicia, you know something heard you at that point. So maybe you don't have the answer to this Bible thing and how it came together. But maybe it's worth the journey to search and find out. Maybe you should look into it. Just because you don't know the answer doesn't mean there isn't an answer. It just means you don't know the answer. So don't just throw it away. And so I had to do something that was more than just saying, I don't know. And so I did. And I'm glad I had that point of wrestling because it really helped shape me and helped me understand when other people are wrestling that it's okay. Welcome to the world. I know I've met apologists who wrestle, and at some point we question, and that's normal, completely normal, because you don't want to believe something just because your mom and dad told you it was true because it's something you always did. You need to know it's true yourself. So with that said, I gave you the answer in the beginning, Christianity works. Now I could sit here as an apologist, and traditionally the way apologists would do things is we are really evidence-based, which I like. Right? Give me a crime scene. Like I took a forensic science class in college, and you had a crime scene, fingerprints and blood and all these things, right? Give me the evidence, and let me conclude what I need to conclude from the evidence, right? So apologists are really good at giving proof, right? So I feel like me coming up here before you and not giving some bit of proof would be a bit wouldn't make sense, because I think proof is really important to me, right? So one of the reasons why I'm a Christian is definitely because I think it's the most evidence-based belief that we have. Do we have proof for everything in the Bible? Absolutely not. Okay, people oftentimes wonder, is there proof for the Exodus? Well, it's interesting. I talked to a PhD archaeology friend of mine, atheist, who does archaeology, and I said, would you expect to find evidence of the Exodus out of Egypt, of the Hebrews? And she was like, no. She goes, the reason is those kind of nomadic groups oftentimes brought stuff with them that they had to be able to carry and was perishable. So you wouldn't really expect to find those kind of things necessarily. Just an example, there's other people who may have a different answer, but it was just interesting as I began to research how much evidence we do for Christianity. So here's one that I think is pretty fun, and I think is pretty cool, and maybe you will as well, is the idea that in 1933, they found a 9th century stone slab at the site of Tel Dan in northern Israel. In the stone slab, the Aramean king boasts that under the guidance of the god Hadad, he brags of killing several thousand Israelite and Judahite horsemen and charioteers. So what's interesting about this slab is that the king boasts of having victory over the king of Israel and the king of the house of David, which is very interesting because he's acknowledging the existence of King David when he says the king of the house of David, but they're also acknowledging that David is the founder of the kingdom of Judah, which is fascinating, on the stone slab that this person is boasting over their defeat. Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate was an interesting one. You're very familiar with Pontius Pilate because you read the New Testament, but you may not have known, we don't have a lot of information on Pontius Pilate outside of a few sources like Josephus, who was a Jewish historian, Tacitus, who's a Roman historian, and Philo. However, in 1961, we found a Pilate stone, is what they call it, near the theater in Caesarea Maritima. And this is what it reads: Tiberium, and then there's some other words, Pontius Pilate, some other words, prefect of Judah, which is really cool. And that's a really interesting thing that you would discover. That additionally, 1968, 1969, somewhere around there, they found a 2,000-year-old ring. And the inscription mentions Pilate as well. So you have these extra biblical sources for Pontius Pilate that are mentioned, and even for King David. Another thing I saw that was interesting was the discovery. I was listening to a podcast recently, not a podcast, YouTube video or something, I don't know, of the archaeologists who discovered Sodom from Sodom and Gomorrah. Very interesting, because long story short, basically they had been searching for Sodom for a long time, but they were looking at the wrong spot. He looked at what the Bible said it was, and he's like, why are we digging here? It's a completely different spot. Started digging there, and they got to this particular layer that looked like things had been like burned, or like there was ash, like it was a complete different layer as they dug. And then they started finding these like pottery type things. So they sent it off to these people that study, I forget what the field is, these kind of things, but whatever. But they were like, well, where'd you get this from? Because it looks glazed, but glazed pottery didn't come around until the 500s or so with Islam. This is way before Islam. Where did you get this glazed pottery? And they're like, well, they told them where they found it. And they were like, what? So they're looking at this pottery, and they're running it through. It turns out it wasn't glazed in kind of the traditional way. Basically, as they looked at it, they said this was subjected to an intense heat. This heat was so intense that in order to get this kind of glazed type look, it had to have been exposed to this intense heat for 1 millisecond. If it was exposed any longer, it would have just completely like burnt up or turned to ash or whatever, burn it. So it was 1 millisecond, and whatever it was super high heat, which is interesting. Because as the archaeologists were digging and looked, well, they got some of the material to take to the person who does the chemical compounds, and this person was like, wow, there's some really interesting things in here. One of the things in here is something called osmium, I believe it's called. The reason why that matters is because that's not found on planet Earth. That is something from outer space. How in the world did that get in the ground, buried this deep? So what happened is they began to say, okay, when you look at the biblical account, it talks about how sulfur rained down from the heavens, which is fascinating because the heat needed to turn that pottery into that quick glaze for 1 millisecond needed to be, I believe, 5,000 degrees, which is the temperature of the surface of the sun. Nothing on planet Earth is that hot. So whatever destroyed Sodom came from out there, was so intense and so like quick or whatever. It was serious in terms of heat. And it caused that to shape the way it was. And it also caused us to get these osmium type element deposits. Very interesting stuff to me as I'm listening to this just recently. There's so many evidence I give you for the Bible. I mean, we always talk about the evidence for the resurrection. We talk about the credibility of the Bible. Believe it or not, the textual credibility of the Bible is actually much, much better than how my young mind understood it. We can talk about the places that are there and the names that were used. I mean, it's honestly, as a Christian, it is like ridiculous the amount of evidence that I get for this faith. Like we are spoiled, really, we are spoiled with what we have at our disposal in comparison to other belief systems. So I find that important because as a criminal justice major, it's really important to me to know that there actually is evidence. But that doesn't necessarily mean that Jesus died and rose from the dead, does it? It just means that, well, this might have some truth in the stories. And so I would need to go a little bit further, I would think, if I want to get to some things that are going to give me more, I guess you could say something more concrete than just that. So I want to get to something that's more specific to you. And I want to spend a few minutes talking to you about the idea of morality. And the reason why I find this important is because, well, this is also one of the areas I think Christianity works, but because I think it is one of those situations where whatever it is that we believe in, whether you're atheist or Hindu or whatever, you are getting your moral source from something. A lot of people just get it from themselves. They become the arbitrator of right and wrong. So I do what's good for me, you do what's good for you. As long as we're not hurting each other, that's okay. So they get it from themselves. However, I think that's a massively problematic thing, and it's not really a livable thing, because when my morality says I should wake up every morning and hit you on the head with a spoon 10 times, because that's what's good in my moral system, you're not going to like that. But if we had already said, hey, morality is you do what's good for you and I do what's good for me, well, you can't tell me not to do it because I'm doing what's good for me. It's not a livable way. We need a morality that is going to be something that's going to cause all of us to be subject to something. And one of the things I like about Christianity is it gives us that moral framework. And it tells essentially, and this isn't going to be different than Islam would do the same, Judaism do the same. This isn't unique to Christianity. But it would say that we are all held accountable to a source that is higher than us. So whether you live here or in India or in Pakistan or in Brazil, we are all subject to the same moral standard. So when I get up in the morning and I want to tap you on the head 10 times with a spoon, you can say that's not okay to do under this moral standard that we're all subject to, as an example. So with that said, I hear people say to me all the time, but Alicia, I can just do good. We really don't need God. I was just at MIT in January, and the student came out to me, bless his sweet little heart. He was about 19 or 20, he's an MIT student. He told me that he thinks that we could actually follow his morality and be okay. I was like, so you want me to follow your moral system? Yeah, I think I could figure it out. I think I've got a good grasp on it. I thought that was fascinating. All that to say, people say, look, we really don't need any kind of divine source. We can come up with morality on our own. We could be good without God. Now, there is truth to that. I don't think you need to believe in God to be good. That's not fair. Many people that don't believe in God are not Christians and do good things. But I want to share with you an interesting experiment that was done several years ago by a guy named Dr. Jesse Bering. Dr. Jesse Bering is an experimental psychologist, and he specializes in evolutionary psychology and human behavior. He was an atheist. But then when his mother died, there was some kind of like supernatural experience, and that really messed with his head. So he became what's called an agnostic, someone who isn't sure whether or not there's a God, or not sure if we can ever really prove it either way. All that to say, he ran an experiment using 5- and 6-year-olds and 8- and 9-year-old kids. And here's what he did. He brought them into a room and said, here's what I want you to do. You see this dartboard right here? I want you to stand with your back to this dartboard. It's like a little Velcro dartboard thing. Stand with your back, use your weak hand, so in my case, I'm right-handed, so I have to use my left hand, throw the ball over your shoulder without looking and hit that dartboard, and whoever gets the most points gets candy. Right? Now, when you're 5, you will do anything for a Skittle, right? So the kids are like, yeah, cool, right? Okay. So they're all excited. So he tells them to do this, leaves one in the room, and takes all the other kids out. So now the kid's alone in the room. But what the kid doesn't know is that there are hidden cameras in the room and that they're being watched. So it goes kind of maybe how you'd expect. They stand at the line, take their ball, toss it. Well, that didn't work. So another one, toss it, and it flies over there. You're like, this is really hard. Try a third one, boom, and they can't seem to get it on the dartboard. Then they kind of look around the room. Well, nobody's here. One little girl runs to the door, opens it, looks down the hallway. Nobody's there, shuts the door. And what does she do? What do you think the kids do? They're 5. They take the ball, run over to the board, and put it on where they want it to go. Once again, Dr. Jesse and everybody else is watching this in the other room. And he does this experiment with all the kids where they do it. He does a second round. The second round, he changes things a little bit. Used to do the same thing, but this time he puts adults in the room. The third time he runs the experiment, now is when it gets really fun. He tells the kids, guys, this is a special thing. You see this chair right here? In this chair is Princess Alice. And you can't see her because she's invisible. And Princess Alice is going to sit in here. We're all going to leave, but Princess Alice is going to sit in here while you're throwing your ball. So the first time they're alone, second time there's adults, third time Princess Alice is here. And what Dr. Jesse discovered running this experiment hundreds of times with children is that he discovered that when there was an adult or Princess Alice in the room, kids were significantly less likely to cheat. Probably not hard for many of you to imagine, right? And this is what he says. I want to read you some of the things that he says. He says, the adult and Princess Alice are fitting the role of what any supernatural being is believed to do in society. Princess Alice is watching them. She cares about their behavior, and she'll probably act if they misbehave. So what does all this mean? Dr. Jesse, an agnostic, remember, not sure whether or not there's a God, not sure whether or not we can prove there's a God. That's his agnostic self. He says, what does all this mean? It means that an all-seeing, all-knowing, all-powerful, interventionist, moralistic deity, that helps steer people in the direction of good behavior. Very interesting. How do you drive when you're going to the store and you're late? How do you drive when you're going to the store and you're late and there's a police officer behind you? What Dr. Jesse showed is to my sweet little atheist friend who came up to me at MIT is, young man, we are not going to be as good as we think without having some sort of all-powerful moralistic deity watching us. Why? Because once again, I'm not saying that you need to believe in God to do good things. What I am saying is, who are you when nobody's watching? That is different. And what Dr. Jesse's experiment showed us is that when we think nobody is watching, we behave very differently. Think about the different things, and I'll keep it really general here, trouble that people get into on the computer when they think that they're alone. The reality is maybe we can do good things, but we won't be as good as we think we can be without having some sort of belief in God. And what I like about Christianity, because like I said, it's not unique to Christianity, right? Islam would say the same thing. But what I like about Christianity is that morality isn't some arbitrary thing that God picks. He's not just saying, okay, well, we'll call love good and we'll call, lying bad. Right? He's not arbitrary. Love and lying don't exist outside of God, and he's just enlightening us as to what it is. Because then God would be subject to whatever the standard is that exists outside of him, and he's just more telling us what the moral system is that exists. That wouldn't be good for him. Nor is he just arbitrarily picking, because then he could just have easily called lying good and love bad if he's just picking them. But what I like what Christianity tells us is that morality is grounded in the very nature and essence of God himself, right? So when we say things like forgiveness is good, it's because God is forgiving. It's a reflection of his nature. It's a reflection of his character. When we say mercy is good, it's because God is merciful. When we say love is good, it's because God is love itself. So what he's doing is enlightening us to the perfect moral character that exists within him. So we don't have to worry about, is this really good or bad? Or you're not worried. No, it's actually grounded in his very nature and his very essence. Additionally, I would say that I wonder to what degree we can experience and appreciate the beauty of a human being or even this world without knowing who made it. Let me give you an example. I was speaking to a friend of mine, 8 years ago now, maybe 9 years ago, atheist. And I said to him, has there ever been a time in your life where you wish there was a God? He's in his 70s. And he's like, no, never been a time in my life when I wish there was a God. He said, but there have been times in my life when I've been struck by the beauty of creation and been sorry that there was no one to thank. I found that so profound, because what essentially he was telling me is that he loves creation and thinks it's great, but there's a piece of the experience that he can't quite find fulfilled. Like the experience is only half fulfilled, or maybe 95% fulfilled, because he can't meet the creator of it, because he denies that the creator exists. So somehow that experience of creation is incomplete for him. When you go to a museum and you see a beautiful painting, you might say, wow, that's gorgeous. And what's one of the first things you're going to say? Who painted that? Right? It's a natural thing that comes out of our mouth. Why? Because part of, even unconsciously, part of us experiencing fully something is to know who made it. And that is essentially what my friend was getting at. How about this picture here? Let's say I was to show you this painting here, and I told you that the price tag on this painting was $3.5 million. Good deal. Thank you. Thank you. No, I should make it more reasonable. Let's say this painting was $500. Is that better? Okay, so we get this painting, $500, and I'm like, and I'm selling it, I can go up, I'll sell it to the highest bidder. And you're like, what is wrong with that lady? Send her back to Atlanta, send her back to New York, send her back to somewhere, because that's not how we do things here in Florida, right? Well, let's just say I gave you a little bit more information about this painting. This painting was painted by a little girl, 8 years old, who grew up in a war-torn country. And one day when she was out playing with her friends, she fell and happened to land on a landmine. And it took her arm off. This is the first painting she was able to paint with her new, let's say, prosthetic arm or prosthetic hand. Does that now change the way that you see that picture? The minute you know that background story about that author changes the way in which somehow that becomes more beautiful to you. That becomes more precious. One of the things that I find compelling about Christianity is it gives me a framework, because I know the background of the Creator, to look at every one of you in a higher way than if I didn't. This is why atheism really teaches such a low view of the human. You're just the remnants of stardust. You are just vessels for your DNA to do what it does. This is one of the reasons that people struggle with atheism, why it's so despairing, because that's all you are. But Christianity gives every one of us that kind of a story. And I don't know how I could look at a human and see the beauty in them, or see maybe the bigger picture, if I don't know their Creator behind them. The same reason why when we go to the museum, we want to know the Creator behind the painting. We respond to it different. We see it different. And so in Christianity and Judaism, for that matter, the Judeo-Christian view, when it tells us that we are created in the image of God, that is a massively huge statement, because it bestows on every one of us an infinite value that can't be replaced, whether you're born with Down syndrome or whether you're born like an Einstein. You're all equally valuable to your Creator. One of the things, there's a sense in which I talked about morality, and that's kind of, I said, would be true for multiple religions. I talked about beauty and image of God just really briefly there. That's kind of focusing on maybe more Judeo and Christianity, so I've narrowed it down a little bit. But I want to tell you what I think is one of the things that makes Christianity stand out from any other religion. And I think it has to do with Jesus and the sacrifice of Jesus. When I look at various other leaders in various religions, and oftentimes they're pointing to the way to truth, they're pointing to this text, they're pointing to this new philosophy or teaching. But Jesus is very different, because he isn't just words. Jesus does something that is very unique. I remember I had some Jehovah's Witnesses coming to my house once, and I was really struggling with them, because no matter what I said, they don't believe in the divinity of Jesus. They believe that Jesus was Michael the archangel who became a human and died on the cross, but Jesus is not God, okay? So that's a big deal, right? They deny the Trinity, these kind of things. So I was just bumping heads with them, and I couldn't get them to kind of think through the importance of the divinity of Jesus. Anyways, I remember just sitting there thinking, Lord, I don't know how to communicate. Like, what am I missing here? And I remember him showing me something that I thought was really profound. John 15 says, no greater love does anybody have than this, than they lay down their life for a friend. It's a fascinating verse. No greater love does anybody have than this, than they lay down their life for a friend. Then we read Romans 5:8. But God demonstrates his own love for us. And while we were sinners, Christ died for us. Now let's think about this. God demonstrates his own love for us, and while we were sinners, Jesus dies for us. Okay, so God, Jesus, you want to show your love, and you're making him die. Okay, that can seem kind of problematic, right? It's like me saying, I want to show my love for somebody in this room, so Chris, I want you to go out and sacrifice your life so I can show them I love them. Right? That doesn't even make much sense. But in Christianity, if Jesus is God, then it does make sense. Because it's God demonstrating the love. He is the one who's sacrificing himself. So that's me saying, I want to show you how much I love you, so I sacrifice myself. Okay? The idea that the greatest way to show love is through self-sacrifice is probably not new to anybody in here, especially if you're a parent. Especially if you're a parent of someone who's been sick, seriously sick, in the hospital. And so our parents will say, God, just give it to me. I'll take it instead of my kid. Give me the disease or give me this, please, instead of my kid. So when Jesus says, no greater love does anybody have than this, and they lay down their life for a friend, it's not necessarily revolutionary in terms of how we even think today. But here's what I find that's interesting about this. Is that if Jesus is God, which I believe he is, but Jesus being God means that in Christianity, we have a God who doesn't just say he loves you. It doesn't just show he loves you by doing some nice things for you, but he actually shows his love in the greatest way possible, which is through self-sacrifice. Now that is important. Why? Because if he didn't, then if I was to give my life for one of you and self-sacrifice myself for one of you, I've just done a greater love for you than God would ever do for you. If Jesus isn't God and he doesn't sacrifice, then anytime I sacrifice my life for one of you, I've just outloved God. I've done a greater good for you than what he's ever done. It's one of my fundamental problems with Islam. I was in Hawaii, I don't even know, years ago now, and I remember we had doing this event with a former colleague of mine, Andy Bannister, and the topic was, I think, evil, something like that, problem of evil, something like that. And in the Q&A, somebody stands up and they say, what would Jesus say to ISIS? This is when ISIS was on the rampage. Many of you are so thankful you don't have my job now, right? Yeah. And I wasn't the one to answer it, Andy was, but I remember that question always stuck with me. And I can't tell you exactly what Jesus would say to ISIS. I mean, I haven't gotten this, epiphany. There's probably a lot of things he would say. But I do wonder if one possibility that he might say to ISIS would be, you are giving your life for God who will never give his life for you. How then is that God good? How then is that God loving if you can outdo him? I've asked my Muslim friends that, and they don't really have a good answer for me. So I could give you proof. I can give you solid reasons to believe. I can give you all kind of evidence. I can talk to you about a whole range of things here. But as I wind down, I mentioned in the beginning that Christianity works. And I want to share with you a quick story in conclusion about how I think Christianity works. In addition to the perfection of God demonstrated through the sacrifice of Jesus, which is unique to Christianity. You won't find it in Mormonism either. Jesus is just the God of this planet who sacrifices himself, but there's many other gods. But the uniqueness of who Jesus is in Christianity and the sacrifice makes it stand apart for me. And what I've witnessed in the last, I don't even know, couple months maybe, is how other people have taken to following I think the emptiness that has surrounded our world, basically. and how people seem to be reverting back to Christianity in some way. One of the biggest atheists, a woman named Ayaan Hirsi Ali. How many of you heard of a guy named Richard Dawkins? Anybody? Okay, a few. Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, these guys. Okay, Ayaan was in that crew. Former Muslim, in that new atheism crew. These were the guys that were teaching that religion is evil, religion is bad. It's different than the traditional atheism, which taught that we just don't believe in God. The new atheisms teach that religion is bad and evil, and once we eradicate it, the world will be a better place. Because religion makes you do bad things, like fly planes into buildings. It came right out of 9/11, essentially. Kind of, sort of, yeah. It's a response to 9/11, I'll say that. In response to the idea that America was called a Christian nation, and they wanted to be like, no, we're not. We're not a Christian nation. And religion is evil and bad. She was part of that crew for 15 years. Teaching in atheism, only to release a letter last November called Why I'm Now a Christian. And she has now left atheism because there's no meaning to it. It is a meaningless life, it's a meaningless existence, but also the bedrock of our society and the way to fight evil, like Islamism and other things that she lists, is through Christian teachings, the value of human life, Christian morality, the idea that there's imago Dei, that people are all created in the image of God. All of these things underskirt our democracy, freedom of speech. All of these things are Christian principles. And she says, we try and make peace, we try and have negotiations with these people, and nothing ever works. So she's found herself a Christian. If you were going to create a religion, guys, you wouldn't create this. You'd create something that makes you feel good, something that gives you power over others, a religion where you become God yourself, or gods. What you wouldn't create is something that tells you to limit your desires for sex and money and success and materialistic things. You wouldn't create a religion that tells you the last will be first. You wouldn't create a religion where the founder dies, sacrificing himself not for the good people, but for the bad. That doesn't make any sense. You wouldn't create a religion that tells you to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. You wouldn't create a religion that is backed by real historical events, real cities, real places that can be fact-checked and verified for accuracy. And you wouldn't create a religion that tells you to respond to evil in a way that's so counterculture and against our human nature. Several years ago, was it 17, 18? I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the year right now. You guys are going to be familiar with the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina, and Dylan Roof, who was a shooter who went into that church and shot the church members during their Bible study. Just a little bit of history on that church. It was founded in 1818 by a free black shoemaker. And it was a church stood as a beacon in a port city through which many legions of Africans passed on their way to bondage across the growing nation. Torched by angry whites after one of its organizers led a failed slave revolt, Emmanuel rose from the ashes to serve as a stop on the Underground Railroad, even as state leaders banned all black churches and forced the congregation itself underground. Booker T. Washington visited it, MLK visited it. And so this one night, when young Dylan Roof walks into a Bible study, it wasn't very large, about 12 people. They were sitting around a table. He walks into the Bible study. The pastor says, welcome, and has Dylan sit right next to him. An hour or so into the Bible study, the congregation stands up to pray. And it was then that Dylan began firing on the members. A young man, I think he was in his 20s, Tywanza Sanders, tried to stop him. He said, you don't have to do this. You don't have to do this. And Dylan replied, you rape our women. You're taking over the country. I have to do this. And for 12 people, he fired 77 shots. One woman, Polly Shepard, he let live. And he said he was letting her live so she could tell what happened. She's 70 years old. He was in custody within 13 hours of the shootings. And 2 days later, he appeared before a county magistrate in North Charleston to have bond set. About 4 dozen people showed up, relatives of the dead, And other people showed up to watch this whole thing. But one of the people that was there was a guy named Anthony Thompson. Anthony Thompson's wife was killed by Dylann Roof that day. And as they were in the courtroom, Dylann Roof wasn't there. He was in another room. He was in a baggy striped jumpsuit. His hands were handcuffed behind his back, and they were watching him, and he was watching all this. Well, he could hear, but he couldn't see. But they were watching him over closed circuit television. So he couldn't see the crowd, but he could just hear them. I want to read you what happened in the courtroom that day. Many people got up to speak to Dylann, and one of them was Anthony Thompson, who I'd mentioned lost his wife that day. It says, when Roof was brought before the hearing, Reverend Anthony Thompson had been reluctant to attend. He was a pastor of another church. His wife wasn't even a member of that church. She was just there that night. But he was surprised when the judge read out each victim's names and asked relatives if they wanted to say anything. Anthony was determined not to speak, but then found God telling him, get up. So he said, God, whatever it is you have to say, you better say it, because I don't have anything to say. So come on, don't embarrass me up here. God reminded him that he was his child, that Dylann was his child, and that he was a sinner just like Dylann. He goes, and I'm saying to myself, you got to be kidding. I'm not going to tell people I'm a sinner. If that's what you want me to do, I'm going to sit down. But he just kept on coming. So by the time I got to the podium, I'm thinking, yes, I'm a sinner just like Dylann, and I should be able to forgive him just like God forgave me. And so at the podium, Anthony Thompson says, son, I forgive you. My family forgives you. Roof kept his gaze down throughout the hearing, but when Reverend Anthony uttered the name of Jesus, he looked right up into the Reverend's face. I was able to really pierce into his eyes, almost into his very soul, and I saw a hurt young man. Those of you who don't remember, it was a racially motivated killing. It was a black church. Dylann was white, and it was during a lot of the tensions that were happening in America at the time. As Anthony Thompson was walking back to his seat, his body started shaking. From my neck to my shoulders to my arms, like something was going through my fingers. I could feel something leaving me, but I couldn't see it. And when it was all over, I had this peace like none other. I mean, he took away the burdens I was bearing. He took away the pain I was feeling. God took away the anger and the hate. He just took it all away. It was gone. So I know that forgiveness heals. I know what forgiveness can do to a person's life. It changes your life dramatically. The close of his trial in January 2017, Roof was found guilty and sentenced to death by lethal injection. He's now on death row, awaiting a date for his execution. But Reverend Anthony Thompson has written to him. In that letter, I made him aware of who my wife was, so he can see she was a real person, not just a black person. I want him to know that I still forgave him, no matter what. He also told Roof that he would be happy to visit him and help him give his life to God if he wanted to do that. But he's yet to receive a reply. Charleston expected raw violence to explode. You can imagine, we've seen in other cities where people riot and burn the place down. The people who first shared this story with me, because I had never heard this part of the story before, was a pastor in South Carolina. And he said, boy, a gentle answer really does turn away wrath. He goes, because the way that those members responded, the way that Anthony Thompson responded, stopped all of the rioting in that city. It says in Charleston, God's grace was poured out. Dylann was looking for an avenue to start a race war. Knowing that slavery in Charleston runs deep, he figured Emmanuel was the place to go. They said they had people from other cities, other states coming there to actually start a riot. They were just waiting for us as victims who've lost our family members. They were waiting for us to give them the okay. But we told them to go back to where they came from, and that's why nothing happened. If you were going to create a religion, guys, you would not create this. you just lose your wife, you just lose your son, you lose your family members. And the words that the divine being that you believe in is telling you is to get up there and offer forgiveness. Not only did it impact Dylan, but it impacted that city and why it didn't burn to the ground, because they were going to burn it to the ground, the pastor told me. Dallas Willard once said, because I make my living as a university professor and philosopher, I'm frequently asked, why do you follow Jesus Christ? My answer is always the same. Who else did you have in mind? I want to give you guys some time to ask some questions. And you got a good chunk of time. I'm going to bring Nick on up here with me. Nick does our Universe Next Door podcast, which if you are a theology nerd like I am, you will enjoy that podcast. He talks about a whole range of different things within Christian theology. And we never get to be together because I'm always in Atlanta and he's always down here. So I told him when he walked in the door, guess what you're doing tonight? So please feel free to, why give him any warning? We don't need to do that. I don't think that's one of the moral things God tells us, right? Anyway, so what questions do I have for you? Like I said, I don't limit my Q&As to any particular topic. If there's something that you have a question on something I said, please feel free to go to the microphone. We're doing this because there's a live stream. So if there is a topic that I didn't talk about, you can ask on that as well. So please let us know what questions you might have.
And then if you don't ask one, we'll start asking you guys questions.
Oh, yeah, there's that too. You can tell he's a youth pastor. Put you on the spot. And actually, the first question is always the hardest. So who is the fourth? Who is the fourth question that we can just jump right to? Yep, you can just get up and go.
Do you have a favorite argument for God or Christianity that made, especially early on in your apologetic career, that made things click for you?
That's an interesting one. I feel like the one I told you about Jesus is one of my favorites because I think that's very unique to Christianity, this idea that God would sacrifice. And so oftentimes people would say, a popular thing that atheists would say would be, the idea that God would kill his son is infanticide. I'm like, once again, you don't know the biblical story. Because Jesus says, I didn't come to be served, but to serve and give my life as a ransom for many. This wasn't, once again, God sending somebody else. This was Jesus sending himself. This was God sending himself. And I think for me, that one, because I think that's very unique to Christianity. Whereas morality and image of God, and image of God, there's some crossover with some other things with that. How about you?
It's also interesting that people would say infanticide or like cosmic child abuse. Jesus was 33. He wasn't
right?
an infant. It's a really
exactly.
odd thing to say. But
it's true.
One of my favorites was, especially early on, the Kalam cosmological argument, if you've ever heard of that. It was actually formulated by a Muslim scholar, I believe, in the 1200s. But it's A, anything that began to exist has a cause. B, the universe began to exist. C, therefore, the universe has a cause. And that cause has to be outside the universe. The cause has to be timeless. It cannot be made of matter. And it has to be something or someone personal, because we're personal and we're sentient. That was one of my favorite arguments early on. And the key is began. Anything that began to exist has to have a cause for it. And my favorite, this is probably everybody's favorite, but my favorite now is probably the resurrection. I think there's a reason that in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul essentially says everything either rises or falls with the resurrection. All of Christianity hinges on it. And if you could disprove the resurrection, Christianity would be over. It would be a joke. Paul says we should essentially be laughed at. And if you haven't heard of Gary Habermas, I would go research Gary Habermas. He has what's called the minimal facts argument. And over the last 20 years, this has just dominated scholarship in the area of the resurrection. And the reason it's called the minimal facts argument is that it's based off of the minimal facts that scholars, even outside of Christianity, would agree on. So, for example, secular scholars and historians, they would believe Jesus existed. There's nobody who is going to disagree with that seriously. You have even secular scholars agreeing, the majority anyway, that Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate. You have the majority of scholars agreeing outside of Christianity that the tomb was empty, and there needs to be an explanation for why the tomb was and still is empty. Then you have the testimony of the apostles. You have the apostle Paul, who literally just transformed his life and did a 180.
Yeah.
So that's one of my favorites. But if you haven't heard of Gary Habermas, I'd check him out too.
I think at the core, everybody has to wrestle with Jesus. You can ask the world's atheist god, if I can use that term lightly, Richard Dawkins, right? The leader of the new atheism movement, whether or not Jesus existed. He would absolutely say, yes, he did. Right? Everybody believes Jesus existed. There's a few small stragglers out there, but it's so historical, it's so documented that he existed. The question isn't whether or not he existed. The question is always, who was he? Right? So, I mean, the fact that today is February 28th is because this man existed. I'm not, and now we can talk about how the calendar got switched and blah, blah, but the point is his impact was so big that it upended so many different things in our culture. He's written about so many times. He's in all of the major world religions. So, even Hinduism believes he's one of the gods, right? So all that to say, the ultimate wrestle is to deal with Jesus. The resurrection is kind of the rock solid case because nobody's ever claimed to have his body. And we've never found his body. So what happened to him? There's no other good solid explanation. He's just gone. And so that's kind of the lockdown case. But I guess, yeah, so I guess I would say, though, like this, my answer changes over time. And the simple reason is that I just think that there's, just different ways in which people would relate to Christianity and God. So I think all of these reasons that you've heard are excellent ones. The Kalam is a great one because it answers the origin question, right? How did God get here? Well, only things that begin to exist have a cause. God didn't have a beginning. He was eternal. No one created him. Right? And so stuff like that, it works for a lot of different things. So yeah, I would say that it changes with time. It's a great question. Thank you. Anybody else? All right, look at this brave soul. I'm about to say, I hope you were coming this way, not at the door, because then I just totally humiliated you.
I'm actually really torn because I'm nervous about my question.
Okay, that's okay.
Very quickly.
Yeah.
It's emotional for me too.
That's okay.
My spiritual journey started when I was 7. I wasn't born into Christianity.
Yeah.
I had no spiritual teachings.
Yeah.
It was an out-of-body experience that I saw Jesus.
Wow.
Fast forward, coming and go. Everybody's got the same similar stories, come and go with Jesus. Or I realized fast forwarding through this that I was in search of a religion.
Yeah.
And not necessarily Jesus at one
Yeah.
point. So I studied with the Jehovah's Witnesses for 3 years. I became Catholic.
Wow.
I most recently ate some mushrooms and decided to be a hippie.
Right? Wow.
I'm just gonna be
you were
right
trying
out
the
there.
gamut things.
Just trying to find this peace.
Yeah.
And then he came back to me.
Yeah.
He never left.
Yeah.
I decided he was my savior. But it wasn't over. I didn't identify with Christians.
Yeah.
Now.
Yeah.
Because of my spiritual, not religious friends that are good people, that are looking for peace, the only exposure they have to who is Jesus and who are Christians is on CNN.
Oh, no. Yeah.
Is
Yep.
in our politics.
Yep.
Is in our Christian nationalism that is dividing Christianity.
He's got a whole podcast or two on
hold
Christian nationalism.
I probably should start watching you,
Yes,
but the
he
problem
deals with
was
that.
what I hesitated to come back to Christianity was I wanted to love Jesus, but I didn't want to identify as a Christian because
I understand.
there's a lot of hate
Yeah.
out there
Yeah.
that people are identifying as Christians, but they're preaching hate. So my problem when I speak to people isn't about proving Jesus' existence. It's about how do I tell them that there's love, because they don't go to church and they don't get the love that we receive
you
from
get
one
here.
another. So how do I tell them that Jesus is loving when they're seeing, but it's Christians that are stopping
no.
people from coming across the border, and that's not what Jesus would do. And they're seeing, but why would they shame that poor girl that's walking? These are the only things that they see. So how do I not convince them that that's next, that Jesus is real? How do I convince them that Christians are good?
So can I ask you a question really quickly? You said that they see Christians spewing a lot of hate. Give me some more examples. Sorry to put you on the spot there. Go for it. You can say, I've heard all kind of things.
Yeah, it's just that the transgender thing, and
Yep.
I know you know a lot about it. I experienced that. I went through that with my daughter. She was transitioning. She did not,
Okay.
and it wasn't because I didn't preach to her. I did not preach to her. I loved her. I loved her straight through it.
Good.
I went ahead and I called her what she wanted to be called, but I reminded her that Jesus still loved her.
Good.
And I loved her, and I didn't shame, I didn't isolate, I didn't punish her for what she was going through. I was scared. Actually, part of that was what brought me back to talking to Jesus, because I'm like, I don't have the answers
Right,
here.
of course.
I want to love my child no matter what.
Yeah.
So I went through that, and a lot of it is the gay movement, abortion, and it being used in politics and against people. And
Yeah.
that's what's difficult for me when I talk about my faith,
Right.
because they're looking at me like, wait, who are you? Because weren't you pro-life? And I said, I'm pro-love. It almost always boils down to love. It always comes back to love. Those women are in those situations because they're not feeling love somewhere. They don't feel, or they're operating out of fear, which Jesus takes away all that fear, provides the love. But it's those issues that makes it difficult. I don't know if I even asked a question.
No, you did. No, that was, and
Because
thanks
that
for,
was my whole part, was I'm not sure where my question lies here, because there's 1,000 and then there's one.
So what I'm hearing though essentially is, how do I let people know, how do I show people Christianity is good and beautiful when all they see is this nonsense out here, right?
Yeah,
I get it. Totally
they,
get it.
They see,
You're not the first person to ask me that question.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for being brave and doing that. You want to go? You want me to jump in?
Yeah.
I'll add on.
Yeah, so thank you. The first thing is, what I found is sometimes there's a difference between what's considered hateful content and what's considered hateful in the way that we approach it and the way that we go about it. So, for example, if you look at the second commandment, the idea of taking the Lord's name in vain, like saying OMG is taking the Lord's name in vain or an emptiness, but what that really means is that we're image bearers, and we are called to bring his name with us, to take it with us everywhere with meaning and in glory. And so there are times where, especially in our cultural climate today, there are going to be things that clash with what God says is right or wrong. And so in regard to sexuality, I think the ultimate question is, what is your standard for sexuality? And let's say I'm talking to somebody who considers themselves homosexual. Well, I disagree, and I do think that God, who is love, reveals that that is sin, and he gives me the sexual standard, but that doesn't give me the reason to now mistreat that person or to look down on that person. Of course, I think, let's say in the example of a child who wants to transition, like you were describing, I think the most loving thing I can do is try to point them to Christ, to try to be there for them, of course, even if at the end of the day we entirely disagree. But at the same time, the least loving thing I could do, I think, would be just to not care at all and to just allow them to go through with this. And now they're 25 and people don't want to marry them and they can't go back and they're having depression and there's all kinds of issues that ensue from it. And sometimes we want to do what's loving, and we have this desire to do what's loving, but we end up doing something that actually ends up not being loving at all, because it causes the person to suffer, it causes them to be further from God. And what I always say is there's a difference between guilt and conviction. God does not guilt Christian believers because Christ has taken all of my guilt. There's nothing I can do on my own. Sorry, I have allergies. Nothing I can do on my own about my guilt. But God will convict me in order to change things, in order to in order to be more like him. As we're told in Scripture, we're constantly being sanctified. We're being made more like Christ, conformed to the image of his Son. So he will convict me to change things and to do things. And so an example I like to give, and I think we talked about this when you were on the podcast recently, I like to give the example, if you are a paramedic, and one of our student leaders back there actually is a EMT now, and he was an EMT. Oh. But if you were a paramedic and you rush to the scene of an accident, and you find somebody with like a bloody leg and another injury, but their heart is stopped, what's the first thing you're going to do? The first thing you're going to do is try to revive them. You're going to want their heart to work, because going and working on their bloody leg or whatever the wound is isn't going to matter if they're dead. And so the first thing you're going to do is try to start their heart back up. And we don't have the ability to save anybody. We don't have the pressure or the privilege to save anybody. Only God does. Yeah. But the most important thing in that situation would be that we want to see that person come to Christ. And the Holy Spirit will convict them. And as believers, it's a lot easier to work with each other and to convict each other and to hold each other accountable. Like Paul says in 1 Corinthians, it's not really our job to judge those outside the church, depending on what you mean by that. We still have a standard. We know what's right or wrong. But we're really not going to convict many people outside of the church who aren't going to agree with our standards. So the most important thing, as you pointed out, would be A, to love them, B, to bring them to, do you have a loving church community where you attend? Well, I would try to get them there so they can see what a church should look like. And I'm not throwing anybody under the bus, because not everyone falls into this category who I'm describing, but I did do a whole thing on Christian nationalism last year. And you'll see the same thing from Christian nationalists on the right and from those in the woke category on the left. Neither of them are going to be sharing a loving agenda. They're going to both be sharing a self-centered agenda. And so it's important to keep that in mind. But I would try to focus on seeing them come to Christ before anything else. They don't have to stop being gay before they come to Christ. They don't have to get everything figured out in regard to their sexuality or their sin before they come to Christ. Right. But of course, when we come to Christ, he will convict us. So I don't know if that's helpful at all, but I would focus on that, and I would focus on trying to get them to your church if you attend a church that you see as a loving community, and that's what ultimately we're called to do, is love one another. Even if somebody hates us, we're still called to love them.
So Brennan Manning once said, he's a Christian author, he's since passed away, pastor, author. He once said, the greatest single cause of atheism today are Christians who acknowledge Jesus with their lips and walk out the door and then deny him with their lifestyle. That is what an unbelieving world simply finds unbelievable. My friend, I hear your question. You know, over the years, people say, what's the question you don't like getting asked? And it's changed. It's changed, but now it's kind of, it's really landed on, a lot of times this is kind of one of the tops. You know, why is it that if it's so good, Christians seem so ugly? I'm really dreading this political season, because anything that happens out there makes it to my Q&A, case in point, right? And we are going to see a battle and a rift between the Christians, as if we've forgotten that this is not our home. I think it was Michael Ware who used to work for a Christian man, so don't lose your minds, but he worked for Obama. I've met him, I've talked with him, he's a great guy. Worked for Obama on his faith council. And he's got a really good book on politics. Boy, shame on me for forgetting this, but W-E-A-R is his last name, Ware, like you wear clothes, Michael Ware. But he says something on the lines of, the problem with Christians isn't that they are politically homeless. It's that they thought they could find a home in politics at all. This is not our home, guys. We're about to enter what is going to be a very ugly season. I'm not going to tell you where to vote. I'm not going to tell you who to vote for, because that is an individual decision. But what we all need to remember is a couple things. Number one, this earth will be destroyed, and there will be a new earth. Keep that in mind. And number two, what should be on the forefront of everything we do is how is it that we can help push the gospel message forward? And if something we are doing is getting in the way of that, then we need to reevaluate what we're doing. And the third thing we need to do is what she's hitting at. We need to remember that people are watching. And what happens is you try and share this message, God is good, Jesus is good, blah, 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 all these things. And like, well, you guys can't get along. You guys crucify each other. You guys publicly yell. You guys are divided. Why would I want to go in there? I already got that nonsense out here. Why would I want to join your thing? And it's absolutely right. So I get your wrestle. I get your struggle. And this is why what I would love for you to do and other people to do is you're saying, like, how can I communicate it? You bring them to the text. Let me introduce you to Jesus. I get that. One of my favorite verses is Matthew 5:16. Let your light shine before men. They may see our good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. We are supposed to be the demonstration. Christ's hands and feet. So that is what we're supposed to look like. But take them to the text. Because Jesus is the moral standard that we're all falling short of, even as believers. Okay? So I would encourage you to do that. A couple of things I wanted to say on some of the stuff that you mentioned. You mentioned LGBTQ, you mentioned love, you mentioned abortion, immigration. I'm not going to go through all of those. Please listen to his stuff on Christian nationalism. I'm not doing this to plug our stuff. I'm doing this because I want you to know there's resources out there for these questions and whatever questions you have that we don't get to today. I want you to take advantage of the resources. So listen to his stuff on Christian nationalism. Please, also, if it'd be helpful to you, I was just here last week. I did talk to 2 groups on transgenderism. Please feel free. If you go to our website or YouTube, my talk is called I Think Therefore I'm Trans. So that's what it's called. If that might be helpful to you. Also, Nick and I did a podcast on it. And I have an article on intersex that's also on our website as well. So use these resources, okay? I'm just telling you, not to plug us, but because I want you to have something when we're not here. Okay, great. All that to say, I just want to say a couple things. It may be new to several people in here, but just so you know, Christians have always fought for babies. It wasn't called what we call it now, pro-life and pro-choice, these kind of things. But the early church, what they would do in early Christian times, and people would give birth. If it was a girl and they didn't want it, they would do what was called exposing the infant, which essentially meant they would leave it out in like the wilderness or whatever somewhere to either die of starvation or to get eaten by animals. Christians would go and find these babies and rescue them and bring them into their homes. Christians have always been fighting for life, not because they've got this special thing for babies, but because this whole thing I was talking about beauty and image of God thing earlier. Because they know the Creator, whatever that baby is valuable and beautiful. And so that has always been their motivation. Now, does it seem that maybe they get ugly when it comes to these things? Sure. And there was a time in our lives where Christians were all about pro-life, 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 and then you have the baby, and then they were hands off and left the mother on her own. That's not the situation anymore. They fixed that. There are resources post-birth for women who choose to keep their babies. Plenty of stuff out there. So they've gotten better on that. But I can understand that's still ugly to the world, right? You're talking about LGBTQ stuff. Totally get that that's ugly to the world. Because essentially what both of these issues are doing is they are providing a framework to live that is contrary to how the world wants to live. Because right now we live in a culture that tells you, do what you feel, do what feels good. Your emotions should lead you. Let your happiness guide you to what is true. Love is love, we hear, right? Because love is always good. No, it's not always good. We don't allow teachers to love their students. We don't tell husbands who are married, well, I guess if you're a husband, you are married, but you don't tell husbands, you can go and love 18 other women. Love is not always good when you're loving something you're not supposed to love. So we use these phrases, say, well, as long as I'm loving, it's okay. No, it's not. And as our Creator, He's going to give us guidance to help us know the right ways to go. But you have to understand, guys, you see through spiritual eyes. The world doesn't. And we look like nutcases to them. So remember that. How is it that the things you're saying and the actions you're doing, how does it look to the non-Christian world? If this doesn't become attractive to people, your evangelism is going to be very, very difficult. And so don't be ugly this political season. You hear the pain in her heart. I love that you loved your daughter. But even if she had transitioned, I love that you love her. I'm glad she didn't, because there's so many permanent things that could have happened to her. But we don't ever not love somebody because they're gay. We've colossally failed on the LGBT, lesbian, gay, bi issue as a church. We've gotten better, but in the early days, we were horrible with it. And I keep telling people, be careful who you oppress, because nobody stays oppressed for forever. And they rise up out of their oppression, and they remember their oppressor. And they remember us, and they've come for us. Now they got power. Because we rejoiced when they got AIDS. We rejoiced when they died. These disgusting people. Hello, guys. Jesus died for your disgusting stuff, too. You just don't think it's disgusting because you're the one doing it. You're no better than anybody else. And so we need to really change our hearts to really read, how is it when you read Jesus, act how he acted, love how he loved. He hung with sinners and got criticized for it, but he hung with them because if he didn't, they never would get to know him. How do we love the sinner but still be a light? How do we teach this is right, this is wrong, like Nick was getting at? How do we teach this is not okay? Doesn't mean I discredit you, but I'm just telling you this isn't okay. We got to do better with all these balances. So my answer, bring him into the Bible. Let them encounter Jesus themselves. Open up the Gospels and let them read and decide who Jesus is. And bring them to a place like this that's going to be loving, that's going to be welcoming, that they're going to get good word and good truths. Okay? Thank you. I know that was a hard question for you to ask. I think I have time for one more question. Talk to me, my friend. Come on up here. You have gone as far away from the microphone as you possibly could be. It's hot up here?
So I've been a Christian forever.
Okay.
Grew up in a Christian family. One thing I've always struggled with is the fundamental belief that if you don't accept Jesus Christ as your personal Savior, you burn in eternal hell.
Okay.
So my question is, for the people that don't get the exposure to Jesus, for the people that get the same upbringing that we get as Christians in a faith that's similar with our moral code, they live that moral code.
Sure. Yeah.
Don't ever disrespect anyone, as a loving father, how can God send that person to eternal hell, whereas the person that's maybe like a career criminal, hurting children, doing all kinds of evil, and then becomes a Christian, they're going to spend eternal life in heaven.
Okay.
And it's really made me struggle with my faith, my whole Christian life, but recently more so than ever. And it's like, if everything in the Bible is true, and that isn't, then you know what I mean? So,
can I ask you, thank you for this question. Sorry, if you see me writing, it's just, I tend to forget parts of the question. It's just an auditory process issue I have, so I just got to write stuff down so I don't forget. Why this question? Is this a new problem for you?
Well, like I said, I've really always kind of struggled with it. And then there's even caveats to the question, so if everyone goes to hell that doesn't accept Jesus died on the cross, at what point in all of the world do those people go to hell, go to heaven? And I guess my biggest problem with it is preachers that come up and say, if you want to go to heaven, you need to accept Jesus Christ in your heart. And if you don't, you're going to eternal hell. So that's my biggest struggle.
You need to accept Jesus.
I kind of feel like as a collective of Christians, we kind of need to be like, okay, well, the Bible does say this, but as a loving Father and our Creator, I can't wrap my head around it.
Yeah.
Even as I consider myself a Christian, and I've done mission work. It's just I've really struggled with it.
Yeah, I appreciate you. I appreciate you sharing that with us. Do you want to jump in, your amigo? Okay.
Yeah, first of all, the paper is a really good idea.
Yeah, it's helpful.
Yeah, so I think it's a good thing you have that question, actually, because if God desires for all to be saved, then so should we. And so I think as believers, that desire is built in us, that we want to see everybody saved, and so does God. So starting there are two main views. There's the one side of it where there are people who will say, well, if someone hasn't explicitly accepted Jesus Christ by name, then they can't be saved. And then there's the other view, which is called the possibility of salvation by general revelation. And what that view would say is that anyone who hasn't heard of Christ may be judged on what has been revealed to them in regard to God. And so the starting point is that everyone has sinned. Everybody's a sinner. Romans 3 makes that very clear. And so there is nobody who hasn't sinned. That presents an issue. If everybody has sinned, and we need to be saved from that sin in order to enter God's presence, then what are we going to do about it because we have an issue? So with those two views in mind, there are good arguments for both of them. I lean more now toward the second one than I used to. Because when you look at the Old Testament, first of all, you have figures like Job, for example, who were not Israelite, and still they knew Yahweh. You have Melchizedek, for example, these people who clearly seem to be saved, and yet they didn't know God by name. They didn't know Yahweh by name. And when you fast forward into the New Testament, God hasn't changed his means of salvation. When you look at the Old Testament, they were still saved by having faith in God, and Jesus is God. So when you look at Abraham, or Abram at that time in Genesis 15, Abram is considered righteous for believing God, and that's what faith is, believing God. Yeah. I think there are good arguments to suggest that somebody may be able, I'm not confident to 100% say so, but I think there are good arguments to suggest that somebody may be able to be saved based on what has been revealed to them, but it's important to recognize that this wouldn't mean the person is saved apart from the blood of Christ. The question is, can the blood of Christ be applied to someone who has responded to what's been revealed to them without actually knowing Jesus Christ by name? So that would be the question that has to be answered. And again, I don't have a solid answer for you, but I lean that direction. And I don't think it's ironic that if you look at the Human Population Bureau, there are, I think, roughly 112 billion people, according to their statistics anyway, who have lived on the earth. So there's over 100 billion people who have lived on the earth. 2% of them existed before the time of Christ. So God sends Christ in the fullness of time. 98% of people come after that, and there's just this explosion in literature. There's this explosion of what people are able to do. There's this explosion in the population, and I don't think that's a coincidence. So ultimately, I don't think it's a sufficient answer to just say, well, God is graceful, God is merciful, God is just, period. He'll handle it. I think we should talk about it a little more than that, but those are the two views. I lean toward the second one, but that's what I would suggest researching if I were you. If God desires for all to be saved, we should too. And so I think it starts there.
That's great. Would you mind coming back up here just for a second to the mic? This is why it's so nice to have somebody else with you, because I would never have given you those two things. So that was really cool. Thanks, Nick. This is right, because as you talk to different people, you'll hear different ways of approaching. So you're kind of getting the double stuffed Oreo here, guys. Extra goodness. I called you back up because I want to talk with you for a second. Okay. I appreciate your question. I think it's one, like Nick said, we all should want that, right? For people to be saved who maybe, we say Jesus in a way that sounds really mean, like you were saying. So I like your heart, right? Because ultimately you're saying is you want people to know Christ, or you want people to go to heaven. And I think we've all experienced at this point in our lives people who have died and not known Christ, right? And that's really hard, guys. It's really hard. So I've wrestled with this kind of stuff too, so you're not alone in that. So I just want to ask you some questions and just kind of talk this out with you. It sounds really crazy that Jesus would be the only way, right? Since you've thought a lot about this, have you come up with other ways that you find would be more fair?
Yeah, God judging people after they die.
Okay, what's he judging them on?
Their moral compass in life and
Got it.
Being a respecter of persons and, what drove them in their lives. Because, it's just, I don't see someone having a moral compass that's more in tune than a lot of Christians, which are just like, oh, I accept Jesus as my Lord and Savior. Mainly because I don't want to burn in hell forever. So I'm going to go with that one.
He's a get out of hell free card.
Right.
Exactly.
And if I'm wrong, then okay, that at least I had that insurance.
Exactly.
So That's
Exactly.
what I don't.
Totally get it. So if God judged us then, based on how we did, were we respectful, like you said, were we kind to people, did we do morally good things?
Yeah.
That would be more fair.
Right.
Got you. Okay. So what if, just to bring a little further clarification, if I was an atheist, didn't believe in God here, but I did a bunch of good things, I could still be judged and go to heaven, right?
I'm a kind of a
It's
logical
okay.
person,
You can say
it makes
whatever.
a lot more sense.
Okay,
to me. Yes.
cool. No, that's fine. And please, there's no judgment here. Only reason I bring you up is I can't do this with a big group, but with a small group, we can kind of talk a little bit more,
Okay.
So no, there's no judgment here, my friend. You can be honest. If they yell at you, I'll yell back. Don't worry. I got the microphone, so you're good.
Keeping my eye on this guy over
Oh
here.
yeah, no.
All right, bud.
So okay. So if they did they did moral good things, God would judge them. So how many moral deeds do they need to do for God to accept them?
I think it's more about what you don't do than
Okay.
what you do. Like, if you don't disrespect people, if you don't go out of your way to hurt people, like, you're looking out for people like you would lay your life down for people.
Sure.
you know?
Okay.
Like, whereas, like I said, the career criminal that's maybe been into some really
Yes.
evil things.
Yeah. Sure.
And then is like, oh, well, now I believe in Christ and I'm going to heaven for eternity. The atheist who was raised that way
Yeah.
was created to be a very highly logical person, which some
Yeah.
of us are.
Yeah.
The Bible is not a logical book.
Okay.
Christianity is not a logical religion. Like you said, if we made our own religion, it would not be like that.
Sure.
So for the logical person that also has a moral compass that is like the Christian
Yeah.
moral compass, but is like, I don't know that a man did come down from heaven,
Got it.
became God, died
Yep.
on a cross, rose 3 days. I don't
Yep.
know that I believe that.
Sure.
So now I'm going to hell for eternity?
Sure.
Like,
Right. Okay.
doesn't make sense to me. even
Great,
as a Christian.
fair,
Yeah.
totally good. I totally get that. One thing I would say, just because I don't want to be unclear, I do think Christianity is very logical and very rational, and it is for the logical person. But what I'm saying is, if you were going to create a religion, you would create one that seems to benefit you. and gives
Everything
you
in the
power.
Bible is logical to you?
No, I would say everything in the Bible is going to be consistent with the nature of a good God. Now, just because I can't understand it doesn't mean that it's illogical. It's just like I can't understand everything about physics, right? So there's a difference between my understanding and there's a difference between what it is. Okay, so I would make that clarification. But I want to go back to something that you said, because I think it might be helpful here. So you're talking about the things that we don't do, like don't disrespect people, don't be a career criminal, these kind of things. That should matter. So let me poll the room. How many of you guys have ever disrespected somebody? Raise your hand. Okay, so I'm looking and I'm seeing every hand up. So my question is, now we've all passed and we're standing before God and we've all disrespected somebody. Now none of us are going to get in, right? None of us can get in now. Based off of as we're kind of talking, as I'm understanding you, it seems like we all have already failed and now we can't get in. And I may have believed in God, or I may have not believed in God, because like you said, that doesn't matter. But my thing is, now that I've done that thing, I can't get in. So I guess here's my question, or here's my thoughts, I guess, in response to these very good points that you're raising, because these are things that as apologists and Nick as well has wrestled with. We've thought about these things. So here's my thoughts, friend. I know it sounds really mean that Jesus would be the only way. But here's what it does, is it frees you from the burden of pressure from having to live perfectly, which is a goal that you can't ever attain. Because here's what happens. Based on our conversation, what I'm understanding is all of us in this room are going to be disqualified because we've done that disrespecting. And as a result, even though Jesus isn't the only way anymore, our good deeds still aren't enough. Number two, how do I know if I'm just living a good, decent life? Really, what does it mean to be good? Number one, I need some source to tell me that this is good and this is bad. As you all know, in this country, we can't agree good and bad from state to state, let alone across the planet. Okay? So something's got to tell me good or bad, and I've got to be good to that standard of being, whatever that being is. I got to be good, because if I'm thinking I'm doing good, I'm really doing bad, and that by that being standard, I'm in trouble. So that being, I've got to know what is good for that being, and then I got to do it. But I also got to keep track. Because my question is, what is he going to say? Alicia, You needed to do 20,000 good deeds, but you died at 19,999. Oh, well. And I'm just wondering if that way that we've kind of discussed and tried to think through, if that actually is a way that actually benefits you more than if Jesus is the only way. The reason why Jesus is the only way, I think, is a beautiful way, is because it frees me from having a relationship with a God who only loves me because I do good things. What happens is I now can have a relationship with God even though I do bad things, and I can be forgiven and turn from those things as I'm trying to constantly live in a way that's more pleasing to him. And it frees me from having to keep track. Wait, was that a good thing that I just did, or was that a bad thing that I just did? Wait, I don't know. Oh boy, this is really stressful. And you know who deals with this? Is a Muslim. If you ever talk to a Muslim, they are petrified. Because getting into heaven is all about paradise is all about doing a bunch of good things. But they never know if they've done enough. You got to do more good deeds than bad, and you're good at that way, you're bad. They never know if they've done enough. So they live in fear. There's one way they can guarantee that they will get into paradise. Do you know what that way is? You die as a martyr for Islam. If you do that, you're guaranteed entrance into paradise. And that's why you see so many suicide bombing and killing and everything, because as long as they're dying in the name of Islam, they automatically go. That is what a deeds and works-based belief will get you. You will actually start to work so hard to get there that it will come at everybody else's expense. And so I love your heart, because I've often wrestled, God, how is this fair? What about person lives there? What about person who lives there? A person lives there, and I've lost people. But as I've tried to think about the other ways, I don't know what else is actually better. When Jesus is the only way, what it simply means is you're never going to be good enough. Alicia, you're never going to be good enough. Chris, you're never going to be good enough. Nick, you're never going to be good enough. So stop trying to climb up the mountain to get to the God at the top. You're never going to get there, so I'm going to come down to you. And I'm going to be like you. And the penalty, because God can't just forgive us. We can't just die and he lets us in. That's not a good judge. I can't go to your house, rob or steal things from your house. You take me to court and the judge says, oh, Lisa, you're a nice person. Just don't even worry about it. That's not just for you. Somebody has to pay. And so what essentially he says is, look, I'm going to come down and I'm going to pay the penalty for you. And even though you're not good, I'm essentially going to kind of clothe you in my goodness. And you're going to come in with Jesus. And it frees us. Because now I don't have a conditional relationship with God. He loves me even when I'm bad unconditionally. Versus I got to do a bunch of good things for him to love me. I hope that gives you some sense of guidance. And I really appreciate you coming back up here. And it's not easy to say these things to people, but you can see everybody's chill here. And I appreciate your honesty. I appreciate this woman's honesty. Guys, these are hard. These things hurt. Thank you, my friend. And please feel free to come up to me afterwards if you still have more questions. These things are hard, guys. Okay? Not everything that we do when we talk about this is just, well, here's your answer, boom, done. This stuff hurts. It hurts. We don't want to envision anybody going to hell. And so we're trying to constantly find, well, maybe there's another way. But I just don't know of any other way that actually provides for unconditional love. And that's what I want you to know. That's what I want everybody over here to know. That's what I want to know, is unconditional love, that even when I fail, I can be forgiven. Thank you guys for your time. Thank you, Nick, for coming over and joining me. Appreciate you all.
Thanks, buddy. Well, thank you, everybody, for being here tonight. And it kind of feels like we were just getting warmed up. And the good news is, tomorrow evening, the format is this question and answer essentially the entire time. Matthew's supposed to talk for a brief. Can Matthew talk briefly? Is that possible? I think he does. He's going to give a brief talk at the beginning, and then the whole time is going to be Q&A. So if you did have a question, you didn't get to ask it tonight, come back tomorrow. 6:30, we'll start again, and then we'll get to go over these things and many others. But let me pray before we leave, and then we'll get out of here. God, we thank you for your great love for us, God, the love that we have heard testified about here tonight, God, in so many different ways. And we thank you that you have not left us on our own. God, we thank you that you have made a way for us to know you and to be with you. And God, we pray that as your children, that we would be about your business, which is communicating that love to others, God, which is being good representatives of you in this world. And it is having good and clear answers for these difficult questions, God. It is a fallen and broken world that we live in, and there are hurting people that have real questions, God. And the reason that we're here taking this time and hearing these talks is so that we have sufficient answers for those who have difficult questions. So I pray that as we continue to press in, I pray that as we continue to seek out answers for ourselves, God, that you provide those for us in your grace and you give us occasion to share those with others. Go with each one from here, God. Continue to make yourself known to us in new and wonderful ways, God, and give us occasion to share that with others. We love you. We ask it in your name. Amen. Amen. We will see you tomorrow, and I guess Alicia and Nick will probably come